Thank you for being here. Hello, my name is Cole. I'm the associate pastor, like I said. I get to preach this morning. Sorry to cut things short, but as you noticed, the text is pretty long, so I'm trying to make sure this doesn't go super long. But thank you for being here. And school has started. It is mid-August. Everyone's trying to fit in those last-minute vacations, so it's like really great that we're together. But yeah, we are journeying through this summer. The history of Israel, in particular, 1 Kings. Now we're kind of venturing into 2 Kings. The history of the Old Testament and the history of the people of God. And I got a text. Tim said, "Hey, Cole, can you preach this text?" And when I sat down, it's 2 Kings chapter 5, when I sat down, I'm pretty sure, it's kind of weird to admit, if I have read this before, I don't remember it. I'm pretty sure, I don't know if I've ever read this text before. It's not like I'm venturing through 2 Kings that much, but it was kind of refreshing to hear a story that, you don't, it was like I was a little kid again reading something that was really fresh and new. It was actually really refreshing for me. But this story has turned into a top 5 story for me. And I'm not being facetious. I'm not just trying to sell it. I'm not trying to just pique your interest. I really think that this story has turned into like a top 5 story for me. I think it's provocative. I think it's subversive. And as I've read it, I know that it's a cool story because I feel like there's a lot of different ways to go, and I kind of keep thinking about it. And so my hope today is that this sermon, when it's over, my hope is your response will be, that was interesting. But then, in about a week, you'll think back on it and be like, oh, wow, actually, I see where that was going. Oh, that reminds me of that one time and that one sermon. My hope is that it's a subversive story that slowly creeps into your mind and heart. That's my hope. So bear with me. But let's read it. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. This is a story about Naaman. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was an important man to his Lord and high in his favor. For through him God had granted victory to Aram. But the man, though a great warrior, was a leper. And so Naaman, in the story, we are introduced to our first character. Naaman is a commander. He's a general in the army of the king of Aram. And Aram, if you're wondering, what is that today? That would kind of be like modern-day Syria. And I want you to catch what the very first verse of the story just did, if you can see it. Great. Through Naaman, God had granted victory to Aram. So through a foreign country, Yahweh, the God of Israel, was handing military victories to the army that raids Israel's villages. The narrator just says it in passing, like it's nothing, but it's a warning to us that this story is going to be odd, a little subversive. And then the last word of the verse turns the whole text, right? Naaman, he had it going on. He's a great man, high in favor, a decorated warrior. But he had leprosy. He was a leper, as they would say. In verse 2, let's look at verse 2. Once, when the Arameans were out raiding, they carried off a young girl from the land of Israel, and she became an attendant to Naaman's wife. So the wheels start turning in the story. An Aramean raiding party crosses into Israel, takes a child, and this child ends up in the general's house serving his wife. And I want to slow down for a second to say exactly what that is. Okay, so this is, in the second verse, by all of our modern sensibilities, this is a trafficked child of war. It's a kidnapping. She's not a servant in the way we use the word. She is property. And she's been taken in this raid, living in the house of the man whose army took her. And so verse 3, she said to her mistress, I wish master could come before the prophet in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. And this one line tells us something about Naaman's private life In public, obviously, he is a man who collects honor, rank, favor, victories. But I think this text shows us something's happening in his house that's a little bit different, because a captive child who has every reason on earth to want this man dead says out loud that she wishes he could be healed. That's interesting. And I don't know what to make of that, except that maybe Naaman is more complicated than his resume. Verse 4, Naaman went and told his Lord just what the girl from the land of Israel had said. Right? And so here's another window. This man of war, of violence, of honor, of rank, listens to this slave girl, and doesn't just listen. He immediately goes to the king of Syria and repeats the line to him. And you don't do that in his position, in his honor, and his valor. You don't do that unless something under the surface has been eating at you for a long time. His leprosy is a pain living underneath his mind constantly. And the second he gets a glimmer of hope from a captive child, he runs it up the chain of command. And you don't do that unless there's a desperation in you. So verse 5, and the king of Aram said, go to the king of Israel. So the king says, go to the king of Israel, and I will send along a letter. He set out, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. The king says, I think that's better than the little boy who had like 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. I always think about that. That kid ate a lot of bread. Okay, sorry, that was just a side note. That really was a side note. All right, so he sets out, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. So the king is like, go. I'll send with you the gifts on top of gifts to appease whatever and whoever we have, so this can happen for you, Naaman. Like, this is a big deal. I'll do whatever I can to make this happen for you. And so notice that nobody in the scene asks whether or not the healing is for sale, right? They just assume that this healing is going to require something. So, because of course the healing is for sale. Everything is for sale. It's not cynicism. That's just how the world runs, and apparently so does ours still. 10 talents of silver is an absurd amount of silver, and it's not a thank you. He's bringing a payment. And so picture it, the hope, the support, there's this possibility. He loads up his horses, chariots, servants, an armed guard. Naaman's a big deal. This whole caravan is going to cross the border to go honor the prophet and receive the healing that they came to buy. And then something strange happens. Verse 6 and 7. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes. So they've arrived at the king of Israel, and the king of Israel tears his clothes. And it means he's like angry, or he's just trying to visibly show he's distraught. And he cried, am I God to deal death or give life, that this fellow writes to me to cure a man of leprosy? Just see for yourselves that he is seeking a pretext against me. So the king of Israel reads the letter and tears his clothes in shock and rage. And what's happening here is when Naaman shows up with his caravan, he's seeing a Trojan horse, right? He's seeing something's happened that I'm not aware of, and I'm offended by this. He sees the king of Israel's mind is forever in the push and pull of geopolitics. Or there has to be an angle here. What's going on? And according to 2 Kings, from chapter 6 and on is the story of the war between Israel and Aram, Syria. So he had a reasonable guess that something might be up here. He assumes that Syria is manufacturing reasons to go to war. And so he rejects the whole thing. He's like, get out of here, get out of here. And I want to point out, this is the first time in the story that a king, power, talks to power, another king. So a king talks to another king, a king writes to the king, and what it produces in this story is not healing, it produces panic. Nothing moves, nothing heals. The story just kind of gridlocks. He's like, go back home. But verse 8, when Elisha, the agent of God, heard that the king of Israel had tore his clothes, which I think is funny, like, did you hear he tore his clothes? Yeah, okay, I don't know. He tore his clothes. He sent a message to the king So Elijah says, why have you tore your clothes? Let him come to me, and he will learn that there is a prophet in Israel. It's a pretty, actually, cool line. So word gets out that this drama is going down in the royal court, and Elijah hears about it. And Elisha basically sends the king a note that says, relax. Send him to me. It'll be fine. I'll take care of it. So let me take a second. Let me take a second and talk about Elisha for a second. You notice I did say Elisha, not Elijah. As a kid, I don't know, maybe this is you, I was fascinated by this idea that there are these like wild superhero type prophets roaming around Israel. Was anyone else like kind of fascinated by Elijah and Elisha as a kid? Like, I just loved it. That they did all these crazy spectacle type things. And then, like any good TV show, season 2 is that the student takes over and continues the work. It was almost like cinematic for me in my young brain, and I loved it. And Walter Brueggemann actually says that the prophet in Israel was an unofficial kind of office. The prophet was the voice from below, right? Elisha is this prophet, and Brueggemann says that role in Israel had a part to play in how the country functioned. And the prophet was the voice from below, the voice of God speaking truth to the priesthood and to the monarchy about their tendency to forget what the whole system was supposed to be for, right? God kept picking simple, flawed people to be God's presence to the powers. So Elisha followed Elijah around, right? In 1 Kings, Elisha follows Elijah around, and he's learning everything he could, and he saw Elijah's great achievements, but he also saw Elijah's great flaws. And this circles us back to Tim's sermon a few weeks ago on Elijah's methodology. Elisha seems to have learned from his teacher that while Elijah was right and was doing the work of God, his methods were sometimes a little off. The tendency to reach to the spectacle, to show God's power as fire and violence in theater, it's not actually how God wanted to be embodied in the world. Not as a spectacle, but as Tim was talking about, as a whisper. And our text this morning has learned this lesson quite well. Elisha comes along and has learned how the voice of God might want to be embodied in the world a bit. So verse 9. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and halted at the door of Elijah's house. You can imagine this huge caravan pulls up in this dilapidated house of the prophet in the Israelite countryside. Horses, chariots, armed men, several hundred pounds of silver. But watch this, right? Verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go and bathe 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be pure." So Elisha sends a messenger to him. Elisha just hangs out in his house, doesn't meet him, sends a messenger. He doesn't come outside. He doesn't greet him. He doesn't show him any honor. He doesn't acknowledge the caravan or the rank or the silver. He just sends a servant out the front door with one sentence. Go wash in the river 7 times and you'll be clean. Verse 11 and 12. But Naaman was angered and walked away. I thought, he said, I love this. I love sometimes the Bible reads like a Bible and you have to like kind of imagine it. Sometimes the way that it's written, you're like, man, that's exactly how that would go. I thought he would surely come out to me and would stand and invoke the eternal, his God by name, and would wave his hand toward the spot and cure the affected part. Like I thought this was going to go down way differently than has happened here. And Naaman is furious. He's extremely mad. And I don't want it to be lost on us that this is a man with leprosy. And he's so desperate. As we talked about, he's so desperate. He's traveled all this way. And this happens, and he's like, forget this guy. I'm out of here. He's not furious about the instructions. He's furious about the ceremony. I thought he would come out. I thought he would stand there. I thought he would say the name. I thought he would wave his hand over the spot. Naaman had the whole scene written out in his head because he knew what he was buying. He brought money, and he knew what he was buying. So why doesn't Elisha come out, right? What's the move? Like, why doesn't he do that? What's going on there? And some folks think, as I've read, that it's because Naaman's leprosy makes him ritually unclean and Elisha won't come near him. But I don't think that's it. And here's my evidence. In the chapter before, in 2 Kings 4, Elisha climbs onto a dead human corpse to raise a woman's son back to life. So those things, he seems to not be super interested in that. Also, Naaman isn't like quarantined. So he's commanding his army. And so whatever the skin condition is, he's not keeping people away from him. So I think Elisha stays inside and doesn't come outside. And I think that choice is deliberate. I think he's whispering to Naaman something implicitly with his actions. And what he's whispering is, there is nothing here for you to buy, and there's no ceremony you can pay me for. So why is Naaman losing his mind? So, for a really long time, and I think this is true then, and it's still true now, money and charisma and power have been forces in our world that has a kind of gravity to them. Theologically, we'd call them idols, but for our purposes this morning, I just want to say the more money and charisma and power you have as a person, the more gravity you kind of have. And you notice that things start to orbit around you. And I want to be careful here because it would be easy for me to stand and be like, oh, rich and powerful people, oh, yeah, whatever, and say that from a safe distance. I don't want to do that. I have a microphone right now, and I'm standing on this rug, and you all have agreed to stay quiet while I talk, so I have some sort of power. But you notice that something is happening where things are orbiting around me that is kind of odd. And so the sermon kind of represents exactly what I'm talking about. And when gravity collects around a person, it bends things. It starts to bend things and warp things. And I think the first thing it starts to bend when you collect large amounts of money and power and charisma, gravity starts to bend relationships. Everything that comes near you starts to arrive a bit on a curve. Relationships can become contracts. Difference between people become threats. And other people can kind of become servants to your project and what it is you're doing. And that is definitely what is happening to Naaman. It's hard for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, not because rich people are worse, but because it's hard to see the kingdom when reality is bending around you. And when Scripture says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, I think it means exactly that. A root sits at the center of something, right? It sits at the center and things orbit or come out of that. Naaman thinks the favor of the gods is an upgrade. He thinks the love of God is supposed to make your life better. He thinks God is caught in the gravitational pull of his money and his rank, and that God too will show up when summoned and perform for the fee. And he cannot imagine a life outside his own experience, right? But God is calling him from outside the pull, not with a bigger spectacle, but with a whisper. Let's look at verse 13. His servants came forward and spoke to him. Sir, they said, I love this. Sir, they said, if the prophet told you to do something difficult, would you not do it? How much more when he has only said to you, bathe and be pure? And I think this might be the most important verse in the story. So Naaman's standing in the road. He's humiliated and raging, and he's about to get back on his horse and go home with his leprosy and all of his silver. And the people who get to him, who speak to him, whom he listens to, are his servants. Again, this first time he receives the gracious information from a slave girl in his house, and he listens, and the story moves forward. A king speaks, and the story gridlocks. A prophet writes a letter or sends a messenger, and he's about to go home. Then his servants speak to him again, and he listens. Twice now. The thing that moves the general toward wholeness comes from underneath him, underneath his position. And both times, it comes from someone who literally has nothing and cannot gain anything by it. Verse 14. So he went down and immersed himself in the Jordan 7 times as the agent of God had bidden, and his flesh became like a little child's, and he was pure. And there it is. This is fascinating to me. In verse 2, the Hebrew calls the slave girl at the beginning of the story, calls her, my Hebrew, y'all, just bear with me, calls her Na'ara Ketana, a little girl, a small girl. And here in verse 14, when this decorated general comes up out of the muddy water, the text says his flesh became like a Na'ar Katan, the same root word. He's not restored to the man he was. He's restored into the likeness of the child who saved him. And the text is telling us what happened to him, and I think we kind of read right past it. Verse 15. Returning with his entire caravan to the agent of God, Elisha, he stood before Elijah and exclaimed, "Now I know there is no God in the whole world except in Israel. So please, accept a gift from your servant." And I love this so much, right? I love this. He's just been healed. He's just confessed the God of Israel out loud. And the very next thing out of his mouth is, "Let me get my wallet." And I don't think he's being greedy. I think Naaman's complicated. I don't think he's being greedy. I think he's being decent. In his world, this is what a good man does. In our world, this is what a good person does. You receive something, you settle up. And you leaving a debt open is unbearable, right? Because they have power over you. Like, oh, this is weird. In the end, Elisha refuses any gifts. Like, no. Any money? No. And he sends Naaman home with a blessing, "Go in peace." So I used to work at a different church, and when I was young, I was like 25, 26. So this part of the story either makes me sound really young or whatever, it's fine. I was 25, 26, and I was reading a lot. And I was reading a lot of like stuff that was very political and very, I was learning about what America had done to South America and Central America and all of these different things. And I was just like really locked in on it in my mid-20s, and it really bothered me. And I had the opportunity to go to Honduras with a missionary that was at, through the church that I used to work at. And so I went to Honduras, went to Tegucigalpa, and we flew in. Has anyone ever been to Tegucigalpa? Yeah. So you know the airport is crazy. I was gonna die. But anyways, we flew in, and it was wild, man. It was an unbelievable experience. And we went up into the jungle, and our job was to build a church. Like, we were gonna build a church for these people who lived in the jungle, and they didn't have a church. They were meeting in a home. And I thought that was like really good work, and I really was proud to do it. And I have no skills though to build a church. So basically what I did was I went to hang out, and because of what I did, I just started playing soccer with some of the kids out there. And eventually, over the week we were there, every day we were just playing with these kids, and they started like dragging me into the jungle. They're like, "Come check this out." But I mean, in Spanish, "Come check this out." And I was like, "Oh, okay," and it was beautiful. There was these waterfalls, and it was just like, I can't believe people live up here in such poverty, but in such beauty. And it's like, it's just kind of a little overwhelming. And I remember one time, the missionary and I went to this house, and we went to this house up in the jungle, and it was like, it was really run down. And it was a family of one of the boys that was there pretty consistently. And I walk in, and it had no real roof. The roof was kind of open. And I remember they didn't really have much of a floor either, but there was a tree in the middle of the house that went up through the middle, up through the roof, way up. And this boy sees me walk in, and he's really excited. And he climbs up this tree, and he grabs a melon, fruit of some kind off this tree, and like one hands him just way back down, and then gives me this melon. And I'm like, dude, I can't take this. Like, you don't have to give that to me. It's okay. It's okay. And all I can think of is like everything in that moment. There's a lot going on, right? The power dynamics, just how impoverished they are, And I received this thing, and I'm like, man, you don't have to do this. And eventually, I take it, and I'm like, thank you. But you can tell, my whole demeanor is just, I'm trying to shrink myself down. And afterwards, we leave the house, and the missionary, he kind of slaps the back of my neck, and he's like, hey, you need to suffer their kindness. Suffer the kindness. And that phrase has stuck with me, that I was extremely, in that moment, I wanted our relationship to stay transactional. I'll build your church for you. I'll come serve you. But his kindness and grace to me brought all that stuff to the surface, and I couldn't sit with it. And I had to suffer his grace to me. And I'm 41 years old, and I can still feel what that did to me and how embarrassing it still even is. And I had this wish to not have to feel the difference between us, just the reality of the differences between us and what I symbolically mean to Honduras. I didn't want to have to hear the whisper calling me to wholeness, which brings me back to our story. I wonder if the reason Elijah stayed in the house and sent a message is because he knows that Elisha knew in that moment he's actually not the source of the whisper. His job was to direct like a signpost and get out of the way, right? Naaman was on a path that was started and almost completed not by Elisha, but by Naaman's servants. And God whispers to Naaman by way of an unnamed child in his own home who gets one verse, and it sets him on a trajectory towards wholeness. Verse 3 is the verse. Here, I want to read it again. She said to her mistress, I wish master could come before the prophet in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. And that act, that small act of grace to someone who did not deserve it, is more scandalous than I think than we can possibly imagine, actually. Because let me tell you about the world she's in, and let me tell you about the dynamics and how wild that statement is. So she's in a Syrian house, and everywhere in that world, slavery came in two shapes. There were more, but two predominant shapes. There was debt slavery, right? You owed money, you couldn't pay it, so you worked it off, right? But there were limits to debt slavery. There were release years. There were ways out, even in Syria. It was brutal, but it had a door, a way out. But then there was war slavery. And war slavery, foreign captives taken on raids exactly like the one that took her. And for that, there was no term. There was no release years. There was no door. She was permanent property. Permanent property. She was inheritable. You could pass her down to your master's children along with livestock and land. And she is the war kind. She's not working anything off. There's no payment that's gonna help her out. And God moves this entire story through her. Through her. Not through the general, not through either king, not really through Elisha. Elisha's more of a signpost. Go over there and do that thing. God chooses to act and speak through this child. And I want you to notice what the story does not say. It never says God picked her because she was an Israelite. She says she was an Israelite, but it didn't say she picked her because she was an Israelite. It never appeals to her blood or her covenant or her people as a reason for that. What the story hands to us as a reason, I think, is actually her position. She is the one person in the house with no standing, no leverage, no future, and absolutely nothing to gain. She's outside the entire system of exchange. And she chooses to act in grace. And that is what qualifies her to speak for God. Okay. If you're an Israelite hearing the story, let's pretend we were the Israelites hearing the story. You're nodding along right now because so far this is a story about how backward Syria is. What a terrible position to be in. Look at them. Look at what they do, stealing children off the road and keeping them forever. Here's the problem. Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46 says the Israelites may buy foreigners and hold them as property and hand them down to their children as an inheritance. permanently. Israel had the same category that Syria had. Israel had its own permanent people, written into the same Torah that gave the world the Jubilee. And so while you're standing in Israel, being appalled at Damascus, there is a foreign kid in a kitchen down the street from you with no release either. And this text is making the claim that God is speaking through this girl. God is acting and working through that person in that position. Not because of her ethnicity, but because of her social position. And here's the thing I've not been able to get out of my head all week. If God chose to whisper from that position in Damascus, then where is God whispering from inside the people of God now? And I don't think that's a comfortable sentence, because I'm preaching. And I don't think it's supposed to be a comfortable thing. But grace almost never comes from above us. Grace comes from below us. It almost always does. A child born in a manger. Grace almost never comes from above us. It comes from below us. It comes from the people and the places and the lives that sit underneath us, in the part of the room where nothing bends, which might be why we often can't feel it. We can't hear it. We can't find the grace. And so my invitation to us this morning as a church is to consider that maybe God's whisper, God's love to you, God's grace to you, God's forgiveness, God's call to wholeness is not coming to you from this sermon or from your favorite podcast or Instagram feed or book. That grace and wholeness isn't coming from the principalities and the powers. The story makes it pretty clear that the grace of God is chosen to be passed through, to be whispered from the poor, from this neighborhood, maybe. Can you hear it? Can you hear the whisper? Are you close enough? Am I close enough? And the story reminds me that to be humble is to receive something from a direction you do not control. Is to receive something from a direction you do not control. And to let that transformation, the wisdom, the mercy, come from beneath us. To suffer the grace of the poor. To suffer the grace of the powerless, the unwanted. Not to give grace, to suffer it. And so, my brothers and sisters, may we suffer the grace of God until it heals what our money and all of our control issues never could. Amen. Let's pray.